responding and be in conversation with an article that was written by Raphael, Dr. Raphael. The article is titled Slam to Heal, a Poetic Inquiry Reflection. The article is published in the 22 international journal called L'Islambokhad. That's my pronunciation for it. So I'll start, Raphael, I'll start with you. What was your reason for writing and archiving slam poetry?
Thank you, Ongezwa, and welcome. Thank you for having me for having me at this session, and I'm very happy to see you and Xabiso and Busi, and to be able to engage with this article that I wrote. This is an article that is very important to me because I've been a long-term follower and fan of slam. You know, I can actually say that I witnessed the birth of slam poetry here in South Africa over 10 years ago. Mm-hmm. And I've been researching on slam poetry. I've been attending many sessions, but I've been also studying what happens in these sessions. And it took me many years to find an angle, to find a proper angle, to properly, give tribute also to the slam movement. And I ended up, framing this article into this field of study that is poetry therapy. It's a discipline that studies the use of poetry for therapeutic purposes. And when I started doing research in this field, I realized that that's how I, should have written about slam poetry, because I also noticed what was happening in the slam scene and how this idea of healing was becoming more and more prominent, especially in the last few years, and therefore, that was the sparkle for me. When I encountered poetry therapy, as a discipline, I realized that it was a right way to approach slam poetry. Maybe we can talk about other issues with regards to poetry slam, and how it is studied, how it is somehow often misunderstood. But I think that the convergence of poetry therapy and poetic inquiry as a methodology is what allowed me to find the right path, the right research path for me, and that's how this article came up.
Thank you, Raphael, for that input. I think what you say beautifully is we can talk about what poetry, slam poetry means, right? And I think the best people to define this art form are the champions of slam poetry. So we have Busisiwe, a Pretoria-based slam poet, who's a slam poetry champion. And we've got Xabiso, who is the world champion of slam poetry 2022. So, champs. So, champs, my question for you is, what does slam poetry mean for you in where you come from? Busisiwe, do you want to take it, or Xabiso is taking it?
Yeah, I'll jump in. It's a loaded question, so you always got to give us a second to think about it. But really, slam has been such a teacher over the years. I think there's always this exciting thing of discovering voice and discovering self and discovering what we think and who we are through the writing, through the performance. I always kind of remember there was a time when I was in Washington, D.C. at the Split This Rock Festival, and I met Podari Davis, the founder of the Brave New Voices movement in the States. And he said that, you know, the slam, it's like Sesame Street, right? Where everybody kind of comes to Sesame Street and they be like, oh, I like Big Bird, I like Elmo, and everybody has like their favorite characters. But then by the end of it, you've learned your ABCs, you've learned your 1, 2, 3s. So I think that's really the exciting thing about slam, about having this poetry competition, because that's what the slam is, right? It's competitive poetry, and it has to compete, right? Otherwise, you're just doing performance poetry. And having this competition, but then like the slam isn't the point, right? Like the healing and the things we learn through the slam becomes the point. When people start leaving at the end of a show, they're talking about, yes, the performance aesthetic and the writing, but also, you know, we're speaking about how certain poems became mirror for us, or, you know, the speaking about the feelings that we're experiencing, like having left that. And I think slam becomes such a powerful tool and a powerful way for us to hold that kind of shifting and that kind of change.
Thank you so much for that, Xabiso, to hold the kind of shifting and the kind of change. Busisiwe, can you take on the question for me also? What does slam mean for you, where you come from?
Yes, so slam poetry is a competition, like Xabiso is saying. And I think for me, what I'll say, slam pushes the artist to practice. It provides a space where you can experiment with your work, where you can try new things. And what I like about slam is actually how you can make it your own. You can tell the story the way you want to tell it. It allows opportunity for originality. It allows opportunity for you to tell the story the way you want to tell it. And I think as well, it allows innovation. And that was very clear when we moved into like the digital slams like that were happening during lockdown. And you can see how poets are becoming creative. I think at the base of it is the writing and maybe the performance. I'm still working on that aspect. So the performance as well matters. I think for me, slam is having a stage as a young writer, as a young performer, having a space that you normally wouldn't have access to get your work out there, to practice, to work on your craft, but to do that in such a competitive space where sometimes it can be good and sometimes it can be discouraging if you're not doing well in the slam. But it is always important to use that platform to understand and to use it as a tool to have an aim and a purpose and to be intentional, to be intentional about why you're in that space, why you're entering this competition, and what do you want out of it. Besides the winning, what do you want to improve on as a writer, as a performer? What do you want to communicate to your audience? Having that sort of clarity, I think, is the biggest drive for me. And slam has become a platform where I started just being truthful to myself and articulating the work that I want to articulate, and not having to always compare my poems to what is necessary. What does the scoreboard say? These are the kind of poems that win, and to completely remove myself from that. And I think there's a process of healing that happens in that, in believing in your voice, in believing in your story, even if it might not fit a certain criteria when it comes to slam. And I think that's what slam allows us to do. It allows us to be original. It allows us to trust our voice and to show up the way we show up.
Thank you so much. We show up the way we show up. Raphael, the next question is for you. So having been a participant observer, that's how I'll position you, doctor, right?
Yeah.
And coming from where you come from, and in terms of just your academic background, what have been your observation of what slam means and the debates that counter the slam meaning, or in terms of the decadence of the academy?
I mean, yeah, participant observer is a correct definition, because I've always been a very attentive member of of the crowd, you know, in all the major slams. I've judged basically all the major slams in the country as well. So I've always been on the other side, you know, and I'm not a slammer, I don't slam. But as I say, I thought as an academic, I thought it was an important area that needed to be covered, an important research that needed to be done because of what the slam movement represents in this country, in the arts space in general. It's a massive movement. It's a gigantic movement, and it's also managed by the youth. It's created by the youth for the youth, you know, in a country where, you know, old people obviously have messed up, but the youth have created these spaces, these holding spaces, where they, as Busi said, as Xabiso said, where they can be creative, where they can be like open, where they can support each other. So for me, it was definitely a space that deserved my attention, not just as a fan or as a poet, but also as a researcher. And I hope that with this article, at least I put like the South African slam movement on the map, even in the academia, which is something that was not done before. There's no attention to it, unfortunately. And maybe that might be also due because of, you know, the slam poetry is often seen not as a literary space. So that, you know, pulls away literary scholars from it. But it's a very complex space. And the literary aspects of it are it's just one of the aspects. So for me, this aspect of its healing power of creating these spaces where the youth can be opinionated, they can heal themselves, they can heal each other. It's something very relevant that needed academic attention.
Thank you so much, Raphael. What you do so well is you affirm Xabiso's point about that slam poetry is a teacher to him.
Oh yeah,
it has been a teacher to me.
It has been a teacher to me for sure.
Okay, and I mean, so then I want to still dwell on you, Raphael, because I want to excavate or dig a bit. What is this thing about the academy not wanting to or not interested in understanding works that happen in the margins, and I will say margins in inverted commas, right, that come into the center, and I want you to just unearth that. You know, what is it about the university that does this and alienates the thing that we come to learn from, right?
Yeah. I mean, obviously there are multiple answers to this one. You are in the academia yourself, and you know how the academic, I call it the academic circus works, you know. A lot of people just write, a lot of academics just write for their peers. A lot of academics write for careers. It's very difficult to find academics who are ready or able to think out of the box and to look at spaces that are not, you know, conventionally associated with the academia. So if you study poetry in the academia, you will study, you know, the publications, you will study the books that are published. But I mean, they can testify. You go to the performance spaces, and I'm the only scholar there. I've always been, you know. It's, you know, Philippa de Villiers, de Villiers is another one, but there are the scholars are not interested in that space. I think they find it irrelevant from the literary point of view, and they might have a point in that. But again, you know, for me, if that is only what you're looking at, you're missing a lot about this space, which for me, it's, you know, it tells me something about, you know, who you are as an academic. If only if all you can see is what is in the academic market, you understand? So me, by character, by approach to the profession, I've always tried to look for people who are not in the spotlight, for artists that are not in the spotlight, that don't reach, you know, the academic mainstream. And so therefore, when I first encountered the performance space, even before I encountered slam, that also is an understudied space, spoken word. but is not as understudied as slam in South Africa. So, you know, for me, it was a process of keep digging into this space and researching. But then again, as you say, you know, it's something that it's a very unorthodox approach to academic research. You know, academics don't usually go to these spaces because they find it unworthy of scientific attention. But I hope I proved them wrong with this article. I hope that I proved that, you know, this space needs to be studied. More research needs to be done. And I hope my article is just, you know, the first step in that direction.
And thank you for your answer, Raphael. More research needs to be done. Here we go, guys. Young people or academics, shift the boat. Shift the boat. Let's have more slam poetry. And I think for me, it does that cross-discipline thing so beautifully, where it's performance, it's storytelling, it's literature. And so you have these convergences of form speaking to each other. And it excites me from a theater background, because I'm like, this doesn't actually sit just in literature. It can go. And, you know, and it reminded me of, and when I followed Page, because I've been following the Durban slam poetry, it just reminded me so much of the choral poems and Ozake Shange's choral poem form, well, you know, in performance. We've got a question on the floor for Raphael, on the floor online. I don't know how to say it. The question is from Janine Pretorius. I recently came across Poetic Inquiry as a methodology, and I'm appreciating the prospect of this form of expression. Could Raphael please provide some guidance or tips on ways in which one could utilize this in the academic field, or point to useful resources on PI?
Oh, thank you for that question. I mean, as the article says, obviously Poetic Inquiry was one of the two research methodologies that I use, and I created found poems out of the interviews that are reflected in the article. And I think, Ongezwa, you can answer this question as much as I can, because you were at the International Symposium of Poetic Inquiry with me in Cape Town. But I don't know if this is going off topic, but definitely Poetic Inquiry is part of my journey as a researcher in the poetry field. And Poetic Inquiry is simply it's defined as poetry in as for research. So it's the use of poetry in research. And I've been mentored by Heidi van Rooyen, who's the pioneer of this research methodology in South Africa. And With been working with her since 2018. And actually tomorrow I'm going to Cape Town to give the first of 3 workshops with scholars and poets from all over the country to train them in this methodology. So it's something that is also gaining ground in South Africa. Professor Van Rooyen started it, but there are more and more researchers from all fields. I'm telling you, from medicine to engineering. It's not just a literature thing. Actually, it's not even literature is marginal in the field. It's mostly human and social scientists. And it's the use of poetry in research. And the community in South Africa that uses this methodology is growing. I think, you know, also thanks to our research group. You know, you were there last year in Cape Town. You saw how successful that conference was, and how many people it attracted. So I hope that more and more people will use poetry in research. There's a growing concern about how academics write, and there's a growing openness to poetry from scholars that did not even think about it before. You know, it's amazing to see a medical doctor, you know, writing a poem for his PhD thesis, or an electric engineer, you know, using poetry in their work. So Poetic Inquiry allows you to do that, and I've been embracing it since I discovered it.
Thank you, Raphael, for that question. I'll just add, in terms of the work that Poetry Africa is doing right now, they've just partnered up with Medical School and medical school. Busisiwe, you guys could go there, and Xabiso, they've got an organization. The young people open up an organization called Voice. I'm gonna get the title wrong, but it's medical students who've actually created a space for themselves to actually explore poetry. And so we had one day where we had the dean of medical school there, and it's supported by the medical school dean. And I think the CCA is partnering up with them. So I look forward to what will grow from there and how we can all engage beyond disciplines and beyond margins. And so I'm excited about that intervention. I did go to the conference, but I'll go back to the champs. Thank you so much, Pretorius, for your question. Please, if you have any questions, just write them up and we'll address them. And please come into the conversation. We're excited to have you here. So the one thing I think about the article, it makes the claim, right, that poetry, slam to heal, that poetry is a healing methodology, or slam, I mean, let me just get it right. Slam poetry is a healing methodology or method, or and so how do you, and you, Busisiwe and Xabiso, are actually quoted in the article. And the most beautiful thing, I think, for me, the article, before I ask this question, because is the fact that you are quoted and Suzea is quoted, right? And so to be in conversation with, to see young people in South Africa be in conversation with Amy Suzea, I got so excited, right? So what I want you to answer for us is, how does slam poetry for you become a healing method?
A healing method even before I get to the competition space, before I step on the stage. I think most of the healing work is done in the process of writing. That's when I have to sit with what I write during the editing process mostly, because my writing process is mostly just me opening a page and just writing and seeing how far I go with that. I love the process of discovery, but I think the actual writing is me making decisions of what I keep. And in that editing process, there's so much conversation that I have to have with myself. Why are we keeping this? Why is this imagery in here? What does this mean? I think that sort of approach is when I get to uncover more from the poem. And sometimes that's not the poem. The poem comes just from a line I like from that whole discovery experience of free writing. But I think just that process is that whenever I'm preparing for a slam, I'm writing for a slam. When I used to slam frequently, most of my poems are actually born out of with the intention of taking them into a competition somewhere. So just discovering what do I want to say and not have to arrive at the page already with this idea. Sometimes it happens like that, but mostly is to not restrict myself and say, okay, I want to write about gender-based violence because that's what's winning slams, but removing that completely and just discovering what I want to say. I think that is the beginning of the healing aspect of it. And then eventually taking the poems on stage, which then you inviting people into the conversation, into what you're saying. And that becomes healing with a community, because afterwards, you'll find people who come towards you and say, oh, this line, when you said this, it triggered this, or it helped me come to this conclusion. And so is the community aspect of it, to trust the audience with your story and to trust that they're listening, to respect that they're listening as well. So there's so much work that goes into becoming clear in what you want to say. but I think is the decisions you make is what do you want to reveal, what don't you want to reveal. And I do love the aspect of having to share, because when I first stepped into the poetry world, I would often like write diary entries, but finding the form of poetry and taking it to stage, I became very, very aware of my thoughts and became brave in articulating them and started speaking out about issues that I care about, things that are often I reserve to myself because I thought no one would understand this. No one would relate to this. So that sort of community, being in community with each other, exchanging stories, exchanging ideas, exchanging experiences, I think that is what adds into the healing aspect. But as we're talking about healing, I don't want to end there. I do want to say that there is more work as a poet, as a writer, that you'll have to do, the work of healing that exists beyond you writing, beyond you standing on stage and articulating your works. There's still work, that actual work that you'll have to do beyond that. But what I appreciate is that it's a beginning. It's like taking your thoughts out of your mind and seeing them on paper, or listening to yourself while you're on stage reciting. It's a way of processing your thought, and it's a beginning. It's a start in the journey of healing, I'd say.
Thank you so much, Busisiwe. I mean, yesterday there was the Toni Morrison conversation. And the one thing about Toni Morrison was that she was an editor, right? And just the emphasis on editing, the editing practice. And what comes out from you is that in itself, that editing becomes a method, right? Of trying to showcase your healing process through writing. And I really appreciate that point that you said. I might have not captured it correctly, but I heard editing and I connected to yesterday's conversation. And I just like the trajectory of where we're going with this conversation. Xabiso, how does slam form healing for you?
I think really holding on to what Busi was saying around that idea of community, and maybe also touching on to the article as well, where Raphael speaks a little bit on that relationship between the audience and the performer, right? Because there's so much that happens there, where I think it's so easily possible to become mirror to an audience, right? Where yes, before you get onto the stage and you begin slamming, there's these issues and dynamics that you're dealing with and contemplating and wrestling with, that you're then getting down onto paper, not necessarily to always find a solution, but to find where you stand and where you are. And sometimes, the poem will reveal so much more than you might have thought you knew. And then taking that and getting up on stage and sharing, that becomes this moment where the audience will resonate with the line, be like, oh my God, I see myself in that. The way in which you've been able to articulate that experience and that lived experience is something I would have never thought of, but now it makes so much sense in the way in which you're saying it. And I think the entirety of that process, from the beginning and the writing to the performance, to then even post performance with de-rolling as well, becomes its own healing process. I mean, there's so many times where we've sat around dinner or drinks after performance and making sense of whatever we've seen, which I really I was doing a little bit of the applied theater techniques last year, and like really wondering around, where does de-rolling happen for us as an audience and us as these performers, and really finding that even things like sitting and eating together, sitting and drinking together, become tools of de-rolling. And so this really becomes a larger, almost lesson plan of itself, right? Whereas you could, within applied theater, kind of write down a lesson plan for whatever kind of outcome you might be going into. You can begin finding the enrolling and the creation of an imaginative world within the beginning of a show, even within the beginning of the writing. You can find your main event where the lessons start to land. You can go into the de-rolling, into the reflections of it. So I think this is also why I suppose it's so important for articles like this to exist, right? Because if there's nobody writing and examining these communities like from the academic space, then there isn't this language to put to it. So already a lot of language for healing exists within academia, but nobody has kind of connected them because they were like, okay, cool, this isn't something worthy of study. Whereas already these tools and these techniques exist so deeply within this community, within slam, within these performances, and really pulling those out. And I think it will only help for poetry to get better at being a healing methodology if we're then able to kind of point it out and say, oh, right, these are the tools, these are the techniques, this is how I can use my own work and my own performances to help me, myself personally, to heal, but also to then kind of carry on and help others to heal as well. Because I always think of this one time where, you know, I strung together like 14 or 15 different poems for like a 20-minute set, and I got onto that stage and I delivered those poems. But then after, you know, sharing those poems during the Q&A, somebody asked, Xabiso, you give so much, like in that performance, where do you go to refill and to get that back? And at that time, I didn't realize that I had, you know, an answer, which then again triggered me into searching deeper for how healings like turns up, but like intentionally turns up, that it's not just something we kind of stumbled upon, but that our practice is intertwined with that healing, which I think it's still something I'm exploring, but I think more and more poets are exploring it. And I think it's going to become an amazing thing to witness in the next few years when artists and poets are able to articulate that and to allow others those tools and the capacity to heal.
Thank you so much, Xabiso. I mean, what is coming out from you very clearly is another provocation of actually looking at a lesson plan in applied theatre that focuses on slam poetry as a method in healing, right? And so whoever is out there, nimamele, right? Oh, you could actually take it on, and thank you for that. One thing that I'm gonna tease out the form a bit, right? And one thing about the form is you've memorized your lines, right? And so you're dealing with memory in terms of memorizing your lines, but also memorizing what you've created. So when you're on stage, and if the spirit moves you, do you allow it? Do you let what comes out then be able to come out then? Or do you just stick to your lines? But also speak to how memory also can maybe, for me, evoke some sort of healing in terms of reflexivity. And Raphael, please join in terms of your memories of watching slam and how it has shifted and it has grown. Xabiso, you can take that question for me for now.
And I mean, so there's so much carried in memory, right? So the idea and the practice of memorization, but also what is it that we tap into, like the body memory, the vocal memory. So I think that quite often the body also protects and holds and and confuses our memory. So there's many traumas that we might not even be able to access that the body holds onto. And so then in this practice of memorization, and not only just because I know in the way in which I memorize, I also use body to memorize, and that leads me to places. And so in that combination of word, in that combination of memory, in that combination of body, there's so much that can be sparked, right? Just in terms of just the bare kind of form of the slam, there's multiple different types of slams that will also allow for, if the spirit moves, if the spirit moves, you be moved by it. There's different forms of freestyle poetry and like pulling from there and what comes up in that. And when you rewatch that, it's like, wow, is that what my body was trying to say? So there is that remembering. There's that remembering as well that exists in that. And so yeah, I think that memory serves as such an intricate way of bringing certain things up to the surface for you. There'll be moments of performance where maybe you haven't changed the words, but the feeling has shifted, and there's something that you access that, like, when you get off that stage, you're breathless and like in tears because again, that constant memorization, that constant visiting is again similar to that editing, right? There's a refining that kind of happens where the finest point of what you're trying to say in the poem kind of stands out after multiple editing, and the performance itself is a form of editing. And so then there's something that happens where you do tap into, because of that revisiting of memory, you're able to tap into something that was lying underneath there that has always been bubbling. And also, again, not just for yourself, but that becomes also like collective memories where we're all tapping into it as well. And we all kind of share that moment, which becomes, I think, incredibly powerful as a healing praxis.
Thank you very much for that. Remembering, it took me into Ngungi a bit, but I'll get there. And Raphael, because I'm getting excited. I think we're writing our own paper here, developing on Busisiwe. I even forgot what my question was. It was about the memory, right?
Yes. I'm also getting excited. So memory, I think for me, in terms of allowing the spirit to guide you, I had realized early in my work that the way I've written the poem and the way I perform it on stage is very different. And during rehearsals, when I'm trying to memorize, what will happen is I'll do my best to stick to the page. And when I forget a line, I'll think, oh, no, I'm forgetting the poem. But something that feels very natural is when I'm on stage and I'm doing the poem, I just allow myself to float with the poem, to go where the poem goes. And that allows me to break away from what I've created from the page. I think it also comes from this practice that when you mess up your poem on stage, nobody knows that you messed it up except yourself. So that has also allowed me to move away from trying to memorize or trying to deliver the poem exactly how it exists on the page. And with that realization, then I became more intentional. I think most of my poems are very different on page compared to the stage. And what I love about the stage is that it's not always final. If there's no video that exists out there. But there's something about publishing on page that feels almost final. I mean, it's not final, but it feels final. It can always be changed. You can always revisit the work and resubmit it somewhere, or publish the second edition of your book of poems. So it's not final, but it does feel final. And with the performance aspect of it, the poem, you have an opportunity to always experiment with it. You can have a performance on this poem this week, and it will sound very slow, very, in a different tone. Also, the audience feeds you some of their energy, and you give it back to them. So different environments as well take into that. So what I love about that is that the poem always feels different each time. It doesn't matter how many times I perform it, or even if I remember all the words, it still feels different. And in terms of memory as a healing aspect, I think what happens with the process when I'm trying to memorize a poem, there's a commitment that happens in constantly returning to this work that you've written and constantly trying to learn it in such a way that sometimes, like Xabiso was saying, it's a form of editing as well. Sometimes you pick up things that could be shifted, and that feels amazing. Right now, I would say I've become lazy when it comes to memorizing. And I think it's because like most of the poems I perform already exist in a book. Sometimes I'll just grab Surviving Loss with me and get there and be like, I'm gonna read this poem, and then I'm just gonna read it. But it's to allow myself the space to also do that. Sometimes in that moment, I do not need to deliver what I've memorized. I also need to read the poem, but I need to read it in community with an audience listening, and just to have that understanding that the work can exist and can be delivered in different forms, I think is what I would say the spirit guiding me.
Thank you very much, Busisiwe. I mean, what comes up is also just the importance of the audience and community in both your accounts. And I'll get back to that. I just want Raphael also to engage us on memory work and your memories of slam within, and how it's shifted as a practice and how it's grown.
Thank you for this question. Very, very interesting and an important point, because as I say, I literally witnessed the birth of slam as we know it today, how it became organized, how it became a structured movement, and I must say that it shifted a lot. Like at the beginning, you would hear, people like bringing on stage very politically oriented poems, speaking about history, neocolonialism, etc. And to be honest, at the beginning, like the slam started to become a space where a lot of emphasis was done on the competition, on the individuality, on the boosting, of someone's image, on people who were trying to build a career in the poetry space through slam. And it came to a point where, for me, it wasn't very exciting anymore. But then things started to change and shift when, slammers like Busi and Xabiso and Vuyelwa Maluleke came into the picture, Mazai, Soli, or maybe even Koleka Putuma to a certain extent. These guys are and were able to create like a kind of healing, emphatic resonance with the audiences that was disappearing from slam, because of what they wrote, because of how they performed their poems. They created this space. They raised the bar. They created a space where, it wasn't anymore about the ego of the performer. It was about creating this atmosphere, this collective empathy, and that connected again the poets with the audiences. It definitely did that to me. There was a time where I stopped going to slam because it wasn't exciting at all. It was very very formatted, very fabricated. And there was, as I say, emphasis on things that I didn't find relevant. But when these poets came, they changed the landscape. And I think that there's no way back to it. And now I think now audiences expect to see this in a slam event, to see what Xabiso, what Busi, and the other poets that I've mentioned have been able to create in that space. There's always the risk to relapse, because people join slam for different reasons, but what I'm saying is that once you have seen these guys on stage, they have set the standards. And for me, that was amazing, and that was pushed me also to pick up the pen, and wanted to have that studied and recorded and archived for the future. So I really always been thankful to you guys because of what you did in rejuvenating, in recreating slam in a moment where it was going down. And I think the audiences felt that very powerfully, very clearly. And that's why also you guys were rewarded with multiple wins, because you brought that natural empathy to the space, and that was what made a difference for me and made slam what it is today, the most powerful, force in the art scene, in the poetry scene, at least. So I think that's the most important part, that ability to create this space where empathy, is the key. And not just, by selling a product, by doing it through poems and performances. So that was absolutely great.
Thank you so much, Raphael, where empathy is created on stage. And I keep on thinking about this audience that heals with you, or who are these audiences besides us who are just I'm gonna speak for Raphael. I'm intrigued by young people's abilities in South Africa, in a continent where it is the majority of people are young people, right? So when you do stuff, I'm like, okay. And also I'm a teacher, so I must keep up with myself. So you guys hold me accountable, and thank you for that. So
I agree with you.
Pardon?
No, I say I agree with you. I mean, for me, the most interesting things that happen in this country are done by young people, definitely not by the old guard, that nothing new or interesting comes from that. And so that's where my attention is. It's not just an idea it's not the idea of keeping up with the times. It's just, I think that the creative force in this country definitely doesn't come from, these old farts. It comes from the young poets.
I'm gonna be naughty, right? It's in a minister of youth and women, but not because Raphael has said anything, but I'm just I'm being naughty. Because we're writing our paper here, because this could be our paper, guys. We're writing our paper here and in conversation. And that would be the framework, right, of the context of where South Africa is for our paper. So what I wanted to ask, right, is again, who are these audiences? Where do they come from? Are you in friendship with them? When you are de-rolling with them, they are reflecting with you.
I've always said, like, the thing about poetry is that it costs nothing to get into it, right? Like all you need is a pen and a piece of paper, and then who knows, like 10 years after you pick up your first pen, piece of paper, write your first poem, you'll be overseas performing to like hundreds of people. And I think that's where the beauty is. I think I've met so many people who have said, when I was younger, I also used to write poetry. So there is already this this intense desire, and also, I mean, this speaks to the form, this intense desire to heal, this intense desire to make sense of, and then the form is like so powerful in doing that. And so I think quite often that audience, you know, if it's not the poets themselves, it's also people who have been, you know, like who did used to write poetry, but also like what's really powerful as well is that quite often when people come to their first poetry event, their first poetry slam, they'll say, you know, I didn't know I needed this up until I needed it, you know, or up until I came here. And so I think that's really why it goes across so many kind of generations and so many different classes and race, because we're all searching for that healing. We're all searching to contextualize our lives. And yeah, that audience then ends up becoming so closely entwined, like in each other, and that community building. Now, you know, some of my best friends have formed from these poetry spaces, which kind of speaks to the power of it, right? Because we're like, we're sitting, we're de-rolling together, reflecting, which then also opens up like this vulnerability. And also another thing is that poets will also be really like honest with each other sometimes when it comes to poems. Be like, yeah, no, I didn't like that one. It's a good thing you didn't win, you know. Which I think yeah, that kind of honesty is necessary and required to be able to help each other grow and to change and again to shift. So yeah, the audience is large and varied, but it's all people coming to search, I think, for the same thing, just in different ways.
All people coming to search for things. I'm not going to quote you because I'm desirable. So basically what I want, I've got a memory of this audience member who was so angry the last slam poet, and he was late, you know, and I was just like, I was like, no, they're still going to slam, because I don't know what I was thinking, but he was so angry. So this young person, so disappointed that he was late. And yeah, this was last year in Poetry Africa. I mean, what you bring so beautifully is the truths that are accepted, the vulnerability, the ability to be vulnerable with no judgment, right? And get critic and be critic in a competition. I don't know if I'd do that, right? At my young age, right? And dealing with the things that we're dealing with. Busisiwe, can you please also engage this question about audienceship? Raphael, I have another question for you. We don't have much time, but on audience. Yeah.
What Xabiso is saying about the audiences, I've also had people who are like, I used to write when I was younger, people who've engaged with poetry before, but I think another group of people in the audience that I've had someone come to me and say, you know, we studied poetry in high school and it was not like this. I did not understand it. So I think what poetry slams have done with their poetry craft is to make it accessible. Because then what you have is poets who are writing stories that are relatable versus like what's included in the curriculum when you're in high school, the writers that are chosen to be studied versus going to a poetry slam and seeing your neighbor or someone who's had a similar experience to you. I think what poetry slam has done is to personalize the poetry craft itself. I think it has allowed audiences and writers to sort of become vulnerable, to share. It's a certain kind of intimacy that sometimes like people's first interaction with poetry, if it was in school, it's different. Like maybe it was Shakespeare, it's very different. And I think those are another aspect of audiences that I found is like just the informal structure of poetry slam or even spoken word poetry has allowed people to access it. It has removed this exclusiveness that was attached to the work, and that is what I really appreciate. So yeah, that's it.
No, I mean, you say a beautiful point, accessibility, right?
Mm.
So that people can actually access the stories. And so I wonder, then I'm going to go to Raphael and I'm going to frame the question as I go, because there's a thing in our forms, you know, in our practices, because we are performers also, where the audience development becomes the thing, right? You know, I keep on saying to my students, I didn't see you there, Nenzandoni, you know. And so, Raphael, what accessibility is one thing that Busisiwe has said very beautifully, that there's accessibility in this form. And so, what is this thing also about limiting audiences to certain poetry that does not have popular forms? Or, I mean, I don't know if I'm making sense with my question. I'm thinking about it, but please engage or put into the pot. Raphael?
If I understand well, are you asking about the form in poetry slam, or how that drives audiences to poetry spaces?
Mm.
Well, I mean, as they say, poetry is slam poetry is poetry written for competition.
Mm.
So the form has to respond to that, and that attracts, you know, audiences, because when you are an active participant in a performance, you know, from theater studies, that makes the performance more exciting for you as a member of the audience. You know, if you compare this to the more formal poetry readings where there is a poet on the podium, he reads, you know, and then he greets and goes out. Slam, by its own nature, it's dynamic. It has to live on the interaction between the audience and the poet on stage. So I think that interaction, that's actually synergy between audiences and poets is one of the keys of slam poetry, you know. And so if you want to recreate that kind of synergy, you know, as they say, that space is accessible. You can also do it from the other side of the space. You can go on stage yourself. It's a very open space where people listen to each other, where you feel heard, where you feel seen, you know, where you don't feel judged. I mean, you are judged because it's a slam, but not in the negative sense of the word, you know. So I think if I understand your questions well, that I think what attracts audiences to slam, in my opinion, or what attracts me at least, is definitely this powerful exchange of energy that exists in these spaces between the performer on stage and the audience. It's something that you don't experience in other poetry spaces. In other poetry spaces, you get something else that slam poetry is not sometimes able to offer. But with regards to the energy, there's nothing as greatly charged as a slam space for me, in my experience. And that obviously is something that we need also that in this country, because it's a country where we don't have a lot of spaces for, you know, community building, interaction, where we listen to each other, where we have intergenerational dialogues, etc. And slam allows that. Slam actually, you know, is built on that.
Thank you so much, everyone. We've just been told that we have 5 minutes, under 5 minutes left, and this was 2 minutes ago. It's quite tight, but I would like to hear from the champs. Just 2 lines.
Okay, yeah.
This is you.
Thank you so much, Raphael. The article was very detailed, like the critical analysis of the poetry slam. I've never seen it like that before, and I really appreciated that. And thank you, Ongezwa, for the conversation. It's been amazing. Yeah, what I'll say to the writer who is in poetry slam is that I'll say diversify. Do not completely rely on the slam platform to share your work, because the scores start echoing and you start using that to judge your work. So I'll say send your work to journals, go on open mics, try to also see your work exist outside of the competition space. That will allow you to not be super attached to the score that the judges give you. And you can use that platform, the slam platform, to grow without having to use that as a reflection of your work. Do not use that to crush yourself. Just diversify and take your work to other platforms as well. Slam is not the only place where your poems can exist.
Thank you, Busi.
Yeah. Thank you, Busi. Thank you, Raphael. Thank you, Ongezwa. It's been a pleasure chatting and talking about one of my favorite things. And reading the article and reading about one of my favorite things within an academic context is also very exciting. I hope that the link can be shared with more people. They can download it, they can read it, that more people will be inspired to engage critically with this space and with this community, to form another way of how these stories can be archived and how they can be remembered and how they can be interrogated. I think that we're in a very exciting time for poetry, even as Busi was saying, this diversification where the healing is happening all around. It's happening in the slam, it's happening in films, like We Are Dying Here, it's happening in virtual reality spaces, it's happening in journals, it's happening on TV and ads, and there's multiple poets using this tool in like a multitude of ways, and so I think it's important to also as we broaden the boundaries of what poetry can do, to also always keep in mind how that healing work, both for ourselves, for community, the reason we initially started doing the work, how it comes out and how it seeps into everything we do. So I think those are my final words. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Slam Champion World 2022. Yeah. Raphael, last words? We still have time.
I just want to thank the two champions for the inspiration and for inspiring me to write this article, which had been there, in my mind for many years, and they gave me the opportunity to finally, find a home for it. And as Xabiso said, the article is free. It's not one of those academic articles that are not accessible. It's open access. So I hope that a lot of people will read and engage with it and respond to it and just, just engage with it. I think as I was saying before, I hope it's just the starting point of a bigger conversation. But without the slam spaces and without the poets, the article would have never been written. So, and I thank you, Ongezwa, for continuing our journey in different spaces. So thank you also for having me.
Thank you so much, guys. And that's about it from us. Slam to heal, and we in community.